Welcome to the Ethic of Research on Poverty. First of all, we want to thank Isabel Cherney, Dean of the School of Education and Social Policy from Merrimack College, for her support and in sponsoring the event, as well as North Shore Community College. This webinar will explore the ethics of carrying out research on poverty, using examples from activists and academics from South Africa, France, and the United States. We will reflect about dilemmas common for many researchers in the social sciences and suggest pathways for meaningful inclusion, participation, and power sharing with those most affected in the process of building knowledge. The presenters in the webinar are Stacy Randall Shaheen from the United States. She is the director of the Adult Learning Center at North Shore Community College, Danvers, Massachusetts. Bruno Tardier from France. He is director of the International Joseph Wresinski Center for History and Research in Bayeux, France. Donna Hay Freeman from the United States. She was director of the University of Massachusetts Boston Center for Social Policy. Bonita Benet from South Africa. She is the director of the District 6 Museum in Cape Town in South Africa. I am part of the team, and my name is Amelia Mayona. I am assistant professor at the School of Education and Social Policy at Merrimack College, and I will be moderating the dialogue. So our first presenter will be Stacy Randall Shaheen.
Welcome, everybody. As Amelia said, I'm the director of the Adult Learning Center at North Shore Community College in Danvers. We serve students aged 16 to 60 plus who do not yet have their high school diploma. They represent 20 different communities from the North Shore and at the present moment, 16 different countries. So I just wanted to share our vision at the Adult Learning Center. I'm not going to read it word for word, but two words I do want to point out are continuous improvement. And that relates not just to the staff, not just to the teachers, not just to the students and the volunteers, but everyone involved at the Adult Learning Center. So we don't assume that just the students need to grow. We know that all of us need to grow in order to be the most effective teachers, the most effective advisors, and the best human beings that we can, which is one of our missions at the Adult Learning Center. One of the things we talk about at the Adult Learning Center are Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And begin with the end in mind basically means that when you set out to do something, think about what you want your end result to be, and that determines what your steps are going to be. When I was getting my master's degree at UMass Boston, it was about children who were involved in a gang intervention program. And I had to struggle a bit with my advisor because she kept saying, you need to take your advocate voice out of your drafts. And that was hard for me to do because I am a natural advocate. I've always been an advocate, particularly around social and economic justice. And I firmly believe that if you plan to research poverty and its impact on the quality of life, you have to think about the end goal with the following question. Now, they might not allow you to put this as an actual research question. They usually narrow it down to 1 or 2. But even if it's not on your paper, this should be in your head. How will your research make a lasting difference in the lives of people living in poverty, the systems that oppress them, and or the policies that systematize racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, etc.? I feel it's imperative that this research question is part of your work. As my next slide shows, are you a researcher or are you an advocate? And if you're dealing with people who are living in poverty, you must be both. And one of the reasons is because the consequences of cumulative disadvantage, which basically means living with lots of risk factors throughout your life, affects you for your entire life. And economic violence is part of that. And those consequences consequences are too high for you to ignore. You can't just be about you and your goal of getting your capstone project done. It has to be more than that. I feel like it's a moral imperative that if you want to work with people in poverty or research them, that you have a moral imperative to speak out, to use part of your research to make a difference. So these are some of my ideas about what the components of ethical research on poverty include. The first one is pretty basic. There is no other. We live in a culture and society and really a world where people are separated, us and them. And when you're thinking about doing research with people, just because you're the researcher or have a master's degree or working on your PhD does not mean that you are the expert. Does not mean that the people you are talking to don't have something to contribute. And particularly with poor people, trying to design a research project in which the people themselves are co-researchers. They're part of your project and they are the experts of their own lives. And be sure that you ask them, what do they think are some of the solutions to the problems that they're facing? And then do what you can to implement their ideas for solutions. For example, if you're working with middle school youth and the parents of those youth complain about not being able to communicate with teachers or the administration or whatever, talk to them about, would it be okay if we co-wrote a letter to the principal or a letter to the superintendent to explain your ideas? Because they should have a voice in the solution and they most certainly have ideas about what's going to work best for them. So be sure that you ask. Including words like the poor or the homeless, those are objects, those are people. So think about what you're writing about and how you're writing it. And as a sociology major, I learned that language is truly the carrier of culture. So your words matter, and especially dealing, again, with people that might not have the greatest level of self-esteem or the great experiences with people, every word you say, they're going to listen to carefully, and it makes a difference in how they're going to perceive you and perceive themselves. When I did my master's research, I made sure that I paid the people that I talked to for their time and participation. I can't think of any corporation that does a study group or a focus group where they don't pay people for their time. So why aren't we paying poor people for their time if we're going to talk to them? So I think that's critical. And I was not able to get funding from the university for that, but I paid out of my pocket because I really feel like that's, like I said, it's just an equality thing that if we're going to pay people to talk about potato chips or something that corporations want to know about, we should pay people to talk about the intimate details of their lives. Meeting people where they're most comfortable. Now, this could be a home, this could be on the phone, it could be on a basketball court. Like, don't expect people to come to you, go to them. And a lot of times people have some trepidation about going into poor communities. Well, that's something that you have to struggle with and kind of get over. I mean, if you're thinking about being afraid to go to a certain community, those people live in the community. So that's their community, and that's where you have to go if that's where they feel most comfortable. Thinking about people who live in poverty, not all of them, but many of them have a high incidence of trauma in their lives for a variety of reasons. So you have to know what trauma-informed care means and what it's all about. And one simple example of that is really thinking about where you sit and where you ask the participant to sit. Many people that have been through trauma, they want to sit closest to the door. So they have an escape route, for instance, if they feel uncomfortable. So you have to know about trauma-informed care if you're going to be working with people in poverty. And my one capitalization here, insist, is that your research includes a policy change section. Even if that's not part of the plan for your school or part of the publication, I was lucky that I got my master's research actually published in a journal, and they wanted to cut out that section. And I said, absolutely not. I'd rather not have it published than cut out that section because it has to be in there. So we have some power when it comes to that, and make sure you use it. Another piece is around fiscal processes. So if you're going to create a book or you're going to do something around artwork, make sure you have systems in place so that, again, people can be paid for that, for their contributions. They deserve that. And in general, the power over versus power with is from day one that, again, you're not the expert and they're the client. You are people to person to person, people to people. And having a feeling of mutuality is really important so that people will open up to you and really feel heard and listened to. And the last phrase around the soft bigotry of low expectations is something that I recently heard on NPR. And I said it was a great phrase because a lot of people feel like they're not, racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever. But when it comes to people that live in poverty, they don't expect a lot of them. I think that's a serious trend for children in particular, and certainly has been proven by research, particularly for African-American boys, that teachers and administrators do have low expectations of them. And that's too bad because they end up dropping out of high school at unprecedented rates compared to other races. So check yourself on that and really think about what kind of expectations you have of people and expect the best. You know, you're going to learn a lot from the people that you do research with and give them the respect and the money that they deserve.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Stacy. For the participants in the webinar, if you have questions for Stacy, please send them, and at the end of all the presentations, we are going to address the answers. Our next presenter is Bruno Tardier.
Thank you. Thank you, Amelia, and thank you very much, Stacy, for your remarks. So I'm talking to you here from the Joseph Wresinski Center for History and Research. It's a center where we keep all the archives of the lives and the struggles and the actions of the members of this organization, the International Fourth World Movement, and of its founder, Joseph Brzezinski, himself born in poverty. So that's 60 years of archives, a lot of writings, a lot of recordings, photos, piece of art. You have some behind me. And many researchers want to look into this. And that's why we also work from here to initiate and follow and guide research initiated by ourselves, but also welcome researchers who want to make research on poverty and want to learn from that history. And I would like to address the why do we need research and with which ethic we engage with researchers. So why do we need research? Because as an activist movement, a movement of action, started in a camp for homeless 60 years ago, our first goal is action, is change. So why research? Our first members were the people in that camp for homeless. First members are people living in extreme poverty themselves who want to become activists in the organization. Then other members are like myself, core workers who live and work in neighborhoods throughout the world. And other members are allies from all walks of life who try to counter the logics of exclusion and the violence of poverty wherever at play in society. So why do we need research and not action? Since the very beginning, we saw that the conventional thinking, what was taught in schools and in universities, was not really helping our action. It was even preventing action. So we had to engage into critique of the dominant thinking. For example, in the late 50s, when ATD Fourth World started in that camp, and then in other European countries, then in North America, at least in Europe, the very existence of poverty was denied. France didn't want to hear about poverty at that time. The notion was that there was no more poverty. Economic growth would lift everybody out of poverty. And the people who would remain in poverty, they were mere accidents or unfit people, or what we call at the time social cases. But Wresinski, who started the movement in that camp where he joined when he was 40, he knew that these were not just accidents. Because in that camp, he recognized his father, his mother, his sister who died from hunger, his brothers. And he recognized people who never organized, were rejected from everywhere, never considered as a social group, but social cases. He felt that, but he needed to prove it. So he asked us to write down, keep proof of all the violence that people in poverty had to cope with. And they connected with other people from other shanty towns in France and then in Europe, and they started to prove that poverty existed in France in the 50s, in the 60s. And people didn't really believe them. So they had to invite sociologists, psychologists to make surveys. People were credible. And they started to show that this was not just accidents, so that person was poor, but this whole family was poor. He was connected with other families who were also poor in other places. And also often people had a history of poverty, and their parents were also in poverty. So they started to decide they had to prove this, and they did two colloquiums at UNESCO in Paris in 61 and 64 to establish that reality. And they started to show that it was not just inequality, but that really people were ostracized when they were experiencing poverty. And that second colloquium coined the paradigm of social exclusion. That's a notion that's now all over the world, but it was invented by that small group in the 60s. And then they created a group of sociologists within the World Congress of Sociology with people from Europe, North America, and they worked and they described more and more, and they described, for example, another phenomenon that we call creaming the poor. Many actions tend to go with the least poor among the poor and abandon the poorest of the poor, and making the group even more weak and the poorest of the poor more isolated. So that was very productive to work with academics. Then there was some sort of a crisis in the late 70s and 80s with these academics. And that crisis was well explained in another speech of Joseph Brzezinski that you can find in the platform of the webinar called A Knowledge That Leads to Action. He addressed this group of sociologists and said, it's all well and fine what we've been doing for 15 years to describe poverty. But he said to sociologists, in fact, your knowledge is not enough. Your knowledge is not complete. And it's not even totally convincing, to say the truth. For the knowledge to be convincing and engaging, you also need the knowledge of people experiencing poverty. People in poverty have a knowledge, he said, and they too are researchers, in a sense that they struggle to understand the world that denies them. I want to quote a couple of phrases from this speech. He says, this knowledge of the poor, people in poverty, not well structured, is about being condemned for life to contempt and social exclusion. It covers everything that signifies facts, suffering, but also the resilience and hope called forth by those facts. It also includes knowledge of the surrounding world, including certain attitudes toward the very poor that only they would know. Yes, indeed, people in poverty look at the world and they see how they are treated, how society can be so violent and in domination. And further in the text, he says, that knowledge is very particular. Even the best researchers find it difficult to imagine these things that people in poverty have in mind. Consequently, they have a hard time formulating suitable hypotheses and questions. They find themselves facing something that they do not have tools to master. It is, so to speak, the secret garden of the very poor. Entry is open only to those who change their life situation and become partners with the poor in a project which is no longer of mere research, but of liberation. And later he says, and there is more. Besides not being able to enter into that secret garden, they would not have the right to do so. In fact, no one has the right, even in the name of science, to hinder another's effort, perhaps clumsy, but nonetheless relentless, to develop a liberating outlook. In other words, Wresinski was saying to researchers, your research are valuable, important, but they are incomplete. People in poverty are also in research to make sense of their life, make sense of the world. And people of action are also in research to understand how action works. And so, from that, on that text, we developed the notion that there are three different types of knowledge, and that have to be developed in an autonomous manner and as equal quality of knowledge. The knowledge of researchers, the knowledge of people in poverty, who have also to be built with its own rules and with other people in poverty. It's not just individual knowledge. And the knowledge of people who work and act together to fight poverty. And so with that notion that these types of knowledge have to be autonomous and equal, and that then they can be cross-fertilizing, they can meet, they can merge. And we coined a method that we call the merging of knowledge with people in poverty. So there's this book here that we published, The Merging of Knowledge, which is the first research that we did that way. And with those notions, we created the code of ethics for researchers who come here to watch our archives. And I will finish by that. The researchers who come here, they are told that any research have to respect the dignity of the individual and the dignity of the groups. The second principle is that research have to respect the right to privacy. So no research can be done here on histories of people without people agreeing on it, giving their authorization for those stories to be used. The third principle is the principle of the right to self-expression. Regardless of the situation of individual, people have an intelligence on their own history, on their own story. And no research can be done, which is an interesting point of view on the stories, without confronting it with the interpretation that people do themselves. The fourth principle is transparency, that all researchers have to have this code of ethics and we shouldn't hide it, we publish it. And the fifth one is that everyone has to know the goal of the research. As Wresinski said, the goal cannot be just mere knowledge. It has to be liberation. And I think Stacy said something similar. In other words, neutrality, which is often claimed by science, can be obscene in front of extreme suffering. If the goal is not clearly to contribute to the liberation of that suffering, we do not open our archives. If researchers say, we have no goal, we just want to learn, we do not open our archives. People in poverty want to know what the goal is. And then when they know what the goal is, when they trust the goal, then they open their knowledge, they open their secret garden, they share their stories. Objectivity is needed, yes, but only to know whether the action is successful, whether the liberation makes progress. Look at people with objectivity, at people's history, is once again obscene. As Ray Hammond, as a friend from Boston, heard from young people from a rundown neighborhood in Boston, said to academics from Harvard who wanted to help, the young people said to the academics, look, we don't care how much you know until we know how much you care. And by this little quote, I want to conclude that yes, conversations are possible if they include commitment, if they include questions of research, if they include interpretation. And then, yes, it's totally possible under these conditions to become co-researchers and to produce research that is pertinent, meaningful, and true and useful. Thank you. I'm done.
And we will write it down, and at the end of the presentations, we will address the question. The third presenter is Donna Hay Friedman.
Go for it.
Hello. The title of my presentation is Sharing Power, an Ethical Imperative for Poverty Researchers. Those of us who carry out research on poverty must partner with people who live this experience and others who are on the front lines in the struggle to eradicate poverty. In Joseph Wresinski's words, as echoed also by Stacy and Bruno, if those voices are missing, such research is lifeless. Brutal life conditions reported from a cool distance by outsiders inadvertently contributes to the us and them dynamic that Stacy was talking about, often focusing solely on deficits and completely overlooking the assets and the resources and the connections that community members themselves treasure and use to survive, the insider perspectives and insights. In the next few minutes, I'll be sharing reflections, learnings from over 25 years of engaging in participative action research focused on poverty. In the United States, those of us who engage other human beings in our research are required to follow very specific ethical standards, including ensuring that participants will experience few risks and greater benefits than risks. All too often, we researchers, myself included, give lip service to this principle, telling potential participants that while they may not benefit from the research, others will benefit from the policy changes that our research will precipitate, hopefully. The San people in South Africa had been told this same story a lot, as reported in a recent article in the journal Science. This over-researched community, known colloquially as Bushmen, had had enough of being used by researchers. They created a code of ethics that any researcher wanting access to their community must follow. It had 3 elements. First, they did not want to be referred to as Bushmen, which is a derogatory term within the local culture. Second, they now require that they have the authority for review and approval of research reports that involve their community. And thirdly, they want real benefits from the experience, not just promises of potential benefits in the future. Such a powerful and reasonable code of ethics. In my experience, the greatest benefits to those most directly affected by poverty and its consequences come from being engaged as co-researchers from start to finish. A university setting was my learning ground for the career I had and continue to have in doing participative evaluation and policy-related research. Many forces within the academy worked against authentic participation of those most directly affected by the harsh realities of poverty. The legitimacy and rigor of participative methods and approaches was questioned. Identifying funders who are willing to invest in this way of generating knowledge is challenging. And thirdly, incentive systems in the academy foster the drive to be recognized as an individual for being smart and outstanding as compared to all others in the field. This is a dynamic that undermines the partnership and power sharing with those most directly affected by the research. These forces are formidable, but not impossible. I now think of the times that I gave in to such forces as moments of lack of imagination and lack of courage. I know this to be true because there were so many other instances in which we were able to engage in rigorous research that had an impact by being very much partners with those most directly affected. For example, the center and team and I have participated in at least 6 or 7 of the ATD Fourth World Movement's participative research, often multi-country and multi-year. And I'm very involved as a member of the US research team in the multidimensional aspects of poverty research. Independent from ATD, I want to give you a few examples of the work that we did. We engaged 4 parents who had lived in family shelters as co-researchers in a project that also involved a College of Management professor and a finance analyst. We were the research team. The results of that research we co-presented to state agency heads, and it did have an impact in their thinking about how to address the family shelter system in Massachusetts. I co-wrote a book called Parenting in Public that was published in the year 2000 by Columbia University Press. And it was co-written with mothers who had lived in a family shelter, staff, and executive directors of those shelters in the state. At the center, we were able to hire a half-time staff person her name is Julia Tripp. She had lived a very harsh life journey on the streets for over a decade before joining us. She subsequently led our team and engaged many, many other men and women who had experienced the harsh realities of poverty, and they became very central to our work. And then there was a participative research project over many years in 2 Boston neighborhoods that are the among the most economically distressed, Mattapan and Dorchester. And I will come back to that shortly. All of these examples have several elements in common. A commitment to power sharing at each stage of the research process, an understanding and confidence that the research at every stage, from design through to dissemination and policy advocacy, was stronger if those with direct experience had meaningful co-researcher roles. Appropriate recognition, including co-authorship, and compensation for their participation as co-researchers, reviewers, and advisors. A sense of shared ownership. And what may be somewhat surprising, an element that a Guatemalan participative research colleague alerted me to, his name is Carlos Aldana Mendoza, is joy. The joy that comes from meaningful, life-giving teamwork characterized by mutuality. During the Q&A period, I will be happy to offer more detail on ethical dilemmas and challenges that we face carrying out some of these projects. But I want to end with the words of one of the neighborhood residents. His name is Lincoln Lamont. He gave me permission to share his name and also to share a quote. He took part, along with many other community residents, in multi-year participative work in his home community of Mattapan. Our team was an evaluation and technical assistance team. In response to a request I received to present this work to graduate students, I asked Lincoln to join me as a co-presenter. In preparation for our presentation, over coffee, we identified 5 to 6 major milestones in that multi-year work. Separately, we wrote down our reflections about that milestone, what stood out for us. Then we blended our individual reflections, which was really a wonderful, enlightening process when it all came together, and we co-authored that and shared it with the graduate students. We titled this reflection, Sharing Power to Build Knowledge for Action. Here are a few of Lincoln's big takeaways from the experience. The partnership between Mattapan United, the community, the Center for Social Policy, and other partners was successful because each entity brought its own set of expertise and experience that was respected and valued. Furthermore, the participative method was embraced because authentic collaboration was valued, arising from deep recognition that each partner played a critical role in achieving the desired outcome, with opportunities for learning from all. The Mattapan United development process was incredibly instructive in demonstrating the value, benefits, and success of the participative research method. The research team should be commended for authentically valuing and modeling the revolutionary concept of treating the community like partners, not subjects. This should not be a revolutionary concept at this stage in our evolution as human beings. All too often, I'm continuing with Lincoln's words, all too often this is not the modality employed by researchers. Is it any wonder that communities often either distrust researchers or the research itself, or fail to see the value of how said research impacts their lives, therefore extending little buy-in, when the people who ostensibly the research may benefit the most are treated as incidental to the process, purely subjects from which conclusions can be drawn. Now my words. For myself, as a human being with a research profession, these participative experiences have been the highlights of my research career, bringing the greatest joy and sense of fulfillment. And I have heard these same sentiments from many faculty, researchers, graduate students, and interns who were part of the research teams. Those of us who have chosen to focus on poverty in our research do so because we want to end poverty and its consequences. The ways we carry out the work in and of itself is in and of itself a pathway for transformation of ourselves and others that for me mirrors the world that I want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. As we were saying before, please continue sending your questions and we will address the questions at the end of all the presentations. And our next presenter is Bonita from South Africa.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation. I feel very privileged to have come after these three very rich presentations, and I can relate to many of the issues that were raised, but I think maybe some of the issues relating to research. Am I live? Hi, so as I was saying, I'm going to be sharing some reflections from the South, some of the ethical issues that we are dealing with. And some of them are universal. Some of them have been referred to by the people, the three speakers before me, and some of them are probably quite localized. So my input emerges from my experience in the context of the District 6 Museum, located in Cape Town, South Africa, together with my broader experience within the field of pedagogy as an educator, and also as an activist involved in the struggle against apartheid prior to its fall in the early 1990s. These three arenas are very closely intertwined and have a common thread, the issue of transformation. And I think Bruno also referred to that. Transformation, very broadly understood. One of the aims of education is transformation in the sense that it is intended to bring about change to an individual's state of knowledge. And also the need for transformation was very much at the heart of the anti-apartheid struggle here in South Africa. The District 6 Museum is a significant site through which transformation has and continues to find its path. Now, just a very quick word about the District 6 Museum. It has its origins in a community struggle to prevent the area from which they were forcibly removed because of racial laws. They were trying to prevent this area from being actualized as the whites-only area that it was declared under apartheid. The vibrant and coherent community was reduced to a wasteland with people's homes, and with the street grid being erased right to the ground. In 1989, there was a conference called the Hands Off District 6 Conference, and the idea of the museum was actually born at this conference, where people made a call for a place of memory, a place to be the keeper of and an activator of the community's memory, because people realized that this was very important in terms of winning their right to claim the land as part of restitution in the new South Africa. And so the museum existed as an itinerant movement. It existed not inside a building, but going around to different communities, listening to people's stories, gathering photographs, and just kind of generating a lot of energy for this place, which would be a keep of the community's memory. And in 1994, in the same year that our new democracy was born, the District 6 Museum was founded. So the museum's origins as a site of struggle, as a place established by and for the community, which had been marginalized but continued to fight back, gave it a very particular character. Since its inception, it has been a place of sense-making, storytelling in order to claim the land from which they were forcibly removed under apartheid, and also their right to exercise their memories and to memorialize in ways which made sense to them. The community's resilience and the museum's ability to amplify the community's resolve to claim their rights fed off each other and created a very strong force. The museum and the associated District 6 community provoked great interest in the research community. It became regarded over time as representing a best practice model of a community archive, an engaged public museum of claiming agency and rights. And this was at a time when thinking was being developing around how to change traditional museums into socially engaged entities. And so, of course, the District 6 Museum became a very interesting case study. And of course, while the District 6 community, consisting of the staff, the trustees, the volunteers, the activists, the former residents, the children of residents, the faith-based entities, sports and educational bodies, many of whom carried more than one identity, while they were struggling with the many issues that needed to be addressed, such as how to ensure that the Land Restitution Act of 1995 was implemented in an integrated way, and how to ensure that the implementation of the Act was activated in a humane and rights-based way, and that red tape and bureaucracy was not the only way that people encountered the implementation of the Act. While they were grappling with all of these things, the museum's processes were quite flexible and very, very relaxed. There were no entrance fees, there were no restrictions on access, there were no forms to be completed. Everything was done in good faith and by negotiation. And many writings emerged from academic institutions and researchers. And the museum was faced with the twin challenge of getting its stories out, but at the same time, figuring how to retain some of its own agency in this. So occupying this newly democratic space meant that residents were very eager to tell their stories, and they were enthralled and captivated for a while by the prominence that their previously silent stories were being given in this new context. But of course, some things didn't quite work out the way that they had expected. Many people who we have met in the museum, particularly of late, those people who were previously disadvantaged and who had been impoverished by forced removals and apartheid, they recall how they've been approached by journalists or researchers very keen to hear their stories. They recall being convinced that the world needed to hear their stories, and they conceded to be interviewed because of that. And while mostly the experiences were positive and cathartic, they were not always so. Many were left with the uncomfortable residue of having embarked on a path of memory that had not been visited in a very long time. And the road to healing through storytelling is not a simple linear process, and there are many difficulties along the way. So they battled with researchers telling them that, tell your story and you will be healed, because it's not that simple. These feelings are exacerbated on occasions when interviewers disappeared after gathering the required information without proper aftercare and without discussion about where the stories would find their way. People who had chance encounters with their stories in places that had not been negotiated with them, in journals that others read and referred to them, in documentaries and in articles, they experienced further distress and often regretted availing themselves so freely to be interviewed. They were left wondering whether the need to get their stories out there trumped the need to be treated with consideration and respect. This is just some of the scenarios, and there are many others that people can testify to in terms of the experience of the telling of their stories. And so the museum's role in all of this has been in trying to create a platform, a respectful platform through which people's voices could be amplified, people could be heard, and trying to put some processes in place, pretty much like Bruno was talking about the archives and ways in which knowledge is negotiated. We've also had to resist for ourselves the label when people would say to us that District 6 Museum gives voice to the community, because that is not how we see our role. We see ourselves as part of creating that voice, part of amplifying the voice, part of creating a respectful platform for people, working with the elevation of knowledge and research, but also at the same time when we're doing that, we're also demystifying knowledge and research and identifying them where they are located in different places. Because I think in South Africa as well, pretty much as in other academic institutions across the world, the location of knowledge is often thought to be residing within these academic institutions. And as Father Wresinski reminds us and cautions us actually about using people as objects to verify or to interpret research, but we need to include them, and we've put some processes in place to create this platform. I was also in reading, I think it's an example in a shorter article on the merging of knowledge. Bruno showed us the book, but the merging of knowledge. I think there's some reference to how to negotiate the language, and I found it very interesting that we often think of people who are not academic researchers and people whose core knowledge and best knowledge is about their life experiences, about where they are, about their situatedness. We often think that they don't have the language to engage with the world of knowledge. And very interestingly, in the short article, I saw a caution that both people who don't engage in this world might not have the knowledge, but also academics don't have the knowledge to take the information that they have out of the world of abstraction. And so it's from both sides that there is a kind of a deficit way of dealing with information that needs to be addressed in the same platform. And so in our work, we've had to slow everyone down. We have had to slow researchers down and academics who came up with suggestions of what the community should do, because the community felt that they weren't being heard and that they actually had much more to contribute than just being the storytellers from which keywords were being lifted in order to verify some research. And so we had to slow everyone down in terms of proper engagements. I know that for research and the academic world, it's very, very frustrating because sometimes there are deadlines that are driven from another agenda, not from within inside the community, but we've had to take these necessary steps of slowing down, building relationships, building respect, negotiating how things take place within the museum context, and also negotiating where these products that emerge from the knowledge, where they find themselves and how people get to engage with them afterwards. And so as a museum, we realize that there are many things about the world of research that we cannot and should probably not control, but we are very particular about the way research happens when people come into our space. We do not hand over a community to be researched by others, but we do welcome and invite researchers and others to work with us in a collaboration to negotiate a more respectful way of doing research. And so we do choose the projects that we engage with. So it's a journey. I think we've had some successful engagements, but I think the lesson that we always hold up for ourselves is that this is never a complete journey. It is something that you learn and you've got to relearn and relearn over and over within different contexts. But I think with respect as the basis and the integrity of people being central to who we are, it is a journey that we are quite open to learning and developing great skills and expertise along the way. Thank you.
You can.
Thank you, Bonita. So we had all the presentations, and now we are going to proceed to answer the questions. And the first question is for Donna. And the question is, how has the research done at the Policy Center impacted the policies, reforms, and influenced political decisions in the eradication of extreme poverty in favor of the poor people?
So I should just,
Yeah.
So what a good question. And I have a few examples I can give you. One of the projects that I mentioned where 4 of the researchers were co-researchers, women who had lived in a shelter with their kids, the research team. That research, we heard later, was taken seriously by the head of the Health and Human Services in terms of the ways in which they collaborated with family shelters and thought about how to prevent family homelessness in the state. And there are many, many projects we engaged in that were focused on the prevention of homelessness, and those people who had experienced it, family homelessness in particular, had a very big role in that. Another example I can give you is that Julia Tripp, who I mentioned earlier, who had herself experienced a very harsh life journey, and helped us engage people with also other hard life journeys. At a certain point, the center had a contract with HUD, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Urban Development. And what ended up being possible with a lot of insistence on our end was that that team of men and women who had experienced life on the streets had a role in creating a policy brief about how shelters, what they should keep in mind when they ask for information from people who are using shelters. That team ended up being also a training assistance team across the state with other municipalities in different parts of the country. Those are a few examples. They never seem like enough. Each one is a drop in the bucket, but this is what we can do, in my mind. We can only do what we can influence from where we're sitting. And those, that is what we attempted to do. The fact that people with a life experience were so integrally involved really, I think, was persuasive for policymakers and in thinking about what the solutions could be.
Thank you, Donna. In her presentation, Stacy talked about the importance to honor the participants living in poverty who participated in the research. So there is a question that says, what is the meaning of the monetary reward? What ethical dilemmas have you encountered? And are there risks in paying the participants in the research?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't classify it as a monetary reward. It's, it's a stipend. It's a recognition that their time is valuable. Just as I mentioned, for corporations who do focus groups and stuff, they pay people because they acknowledge that their time means something. So I think that's a really powerful message to give to people who are living in poverty, that their opinion matters, that their time matters, and that they matter as people. So I didn't find any ethical violations in terms of that. And I don't think it influenced what they said either. I think it helped my research because it just gave people another reason to say yes to do it, in terms of the parents. And I think I got more parents involved than I would have. The school was actually surprised at the number of parents that became involved. So again, I think it's just more of a recognition and that they're worth something, that their voices are worth something.
Thank you, Stacy.
Welcome.
So this is a question that all the participants, the presenter, were talking. And the question is, what are some of the challenges listening to and interpreting stories that are not part of your personal experience? How do you cross the divide? Bruno, would you like to answer this question?
Yes. I can try. There is a divide. We have to recognize it. And the danger to interpret it and so I think the common goal. I have an echo, a terrible echo. The common goal is very important. For example, when we engage in school reform in France, we really changed the laws about cooperation in school and dialogue between parents and teachers. And because we had a common goal, we really wanted to understand what we were talking about. So the common goal is one of the ways to bridge the divide. A school where kids are in tension all the time, kids in poverty are in tension with the others, is something that everybody suffers from. So a common goal is one of the conditions. Another condition is probably to have the double listening. Listening to the story, but don't forget to listen to your own emotions, because sometimes you can be someone like myself who didn't grow up in poverty, you can be so overwhelmed by some suffering that you end up going too fast, finishing the sentence, or offering solutions, even though people never ask you for solutions. So there is a lot of practice of writing, of personal journal in my organization, where we really try to listen, to write the words that people tell us, but also not forget to recognize your own anger or your own emotion or your own sadness. And then you have to be really open to a cross-interpretation. And I think no interpretation is possible without sharing what you understand and asking people what they understand. And but also the last point I want to make about this crossing the divide is that it's not just individual to individual. I think people in poverty build up a knowledge if they are not alone. They can be in a group. They can interpret each other's story, make sense of each other's story before they confront those stories with people like myself from other backgrounds. And for the fourth world, the ATD, it's really central and key that people in poverty can share their stories and build knowledge together before those stories are offered to other people from other backgrounds. And that interpretation, collective knowledge, it's a little bit the same way academics have groups to check what they are publishing. There is an academic community. And I think people in poverty need to also have an academic community where they really build their knowledge together. That's also a better chance to bridge the divide if we admit it, it exists, if we have common goal, if we know how to speak for yourself and listen to the interpretation of others, and most of all, that it's really group work and not just individual work. It is individual and group, both.
Sorry, you have to say it again.
No, I want to read the question.
Okay. Sorry, this is a question for Bonita.
Yeah, this is a question for Bonita. And the person said, I want to emphasize the notion, or you said it, the notion of right to exercise memory. So the participant wants to know, could you expand on that? The right to exercise.
I'd be happy to do that. And so part of what the museum does is not only work with the community for restitution, the restitution of the land, the restitution of very practical rights, but also in the process, we've discovered that memory has a very important role to play in that. So the histories of oppressed people in South Africa, of the Black community, were very much undocumented. They were not only undocumented, they were also deliberately erased. So if you take the landscape of District 6, people's memories, there was no ancestral home that people, no reference point that they could go back to. The homes were destroyed down to the foundation. And so the only way for people to exercise their history, I suppose, was through the channel of memory. And so the storytelling has become a very important part of exercising that right. And I think more and more, not only our government agencies, but also our cultural institutions in our country are realizing that people's memories are so important to configuring this new South Africa that we are all part of, but that we are still on our journey to working towards, and that it's not yet complete. And so the stories that people tell need to find their way into our country's history, into our memorials, into our books, into different ways, actually even into government policies as well, policies that have nothing to do with memory, but in terms of how communities are built. Because I think another fallacy that that people fall into, I mean, even in our country, is that poor people need to have a roof over their heads, they need running water, they need ablution facilities, and all the other things like arts, culture, memorialization will come later. And our argument that we make is those practical things are really important, but we're working with a holistic human being, with the whole of humanity, and they all should become part of the same, and that working access to memory is not only the right of what we would call the chattering classes who have leisure time and time to engage with us, but it's an important part of every community as well.
Make some comments.
I want to just share a thought that relates to both what Bruno and Bonita just said, and something that I mentioned very early in my remarks, which is that I think we as researchers often come into communities where there is tremendous hardship and see what's wrong and see only problems. And in a way, I think a stance of curiosity and of actually wanting to learn what are the aspects of life that these community members really treasure with each other, is a way to understand what is it, how is it that people are surviving. And we know very little about that in the poverty research arena. And I think what happens is that because we know so little and because we rarely ask the questions and really deeply listen, you know, and establish mutual partnerships, solutions that are generated top down can be very harmful and disrupting the connections, disrupting the informal ways that people are supporting each other. We know so little about what is actually at work to enable community members to put one foot in front of the next when housing is not a given, when food is not a given, when, you know, safe water is not a given. How is that working? We really need to be good listeners on that level.
May I
This
say
is yes?
Now I was
Bonita,
going to add on to what you were saying. So I was just going to share that there's a lot of research and a lot of discussion forums happening in South Africa at the moment about what is termed social cohesion and this desire by government to create projects of social cohesion. And my latest bugbear at the moment is like, look at communities, the coherence that is present there. What are people doing? Because if they didn't have any kind of sense, they don't call it social cohesion, but if there wasn't a sense of community cohesion, despite all of the difficulties, people they would just fall apart. And I was very inspired. I've been inspired by lots of little things that ATD has been doing, but I've been very inspired by the book, The Roles We Play, and looking at the kind of social cohesion from understanding how people support each other in communities. So just in terms of, if I can link it also to the importance of memory, if I take a District 6 memory, what people talk about, you might not find it in any book, was when there's I'm sure you know Ramadan, which is the kind of the feast during the fasting period in Islam. During Ramadan, there's all the tradition where people take plates of food to each other. And so the plate goes around to the community. And you always send something back in the plate because it's a sign of respect. But people in District 6 realized that when a neighbor sent a plate back empty, you knew there was no food in the house, that there was nothing to share, and you would send a double plate in the next round. Those are little traditions in the community that people, and we discovered this, by the way, because we weren't asking the right questions. If you ask people, what are the things of social cohesion, they're not going to tell you that. This came out, by the way, and for me, that's just one example. And there must be many others like that. It's about asking, it's not even about asking the right questions, it's about immersing ourselves in the spaces where people are, where we're actually not asking questions, but we're having conversations. And so for me, that was both about how people make things work and also a kind of a testimony to the importance of memory.
And then Bruno.
Also related to that, I think it's important for all of us to remember that at every stage of life, the quality of your life is about the quality of your relationships. And just like as Bonita was talking about, when you know your neighbor is hungry and you respond, there's nothing more valuable than that. You know, we're kind of, at least in America, conditioned to think that stuff is what makes us happy. We come to realize, many of us anyway, that that's not the case. And in terms of crossing the divide, I think it's also important to remember our human connections. You know, I might go into a neighborhood where there's gang violence, and I might not understand that particular fear as a parent about gang violence, but I do understand as a mother the fear of losing my son. You know what I mean? So there's many more connections that we have, many more similarities than differences, if we look at it as a human family.
Thank you, Stacy. Bruno?
I wanted to go back to the question of the right to exercise memory. I think it's a fantastic question. And I think that's a big effort we have been trying to do, realizing that people in poverty have their history destroyed all the time. Their neighborhoods are being destroyed, their shanty towns are being destroyed. And in Europe, at least, many children are taken away from their family to be put in better families, in foster care, or it happens a lot in Europe, it happens in Australia. And so if researchers ask people their opinions, their knowledge on things, if they think that they are alone and that they just an accident of history, if they don't realize that if they don't know the history of their own people, it's much more difficult to contribute knowledge. And so there is a really important responsibility to help people to share their story, to learn about their own parents, to learn about their ancestors. And it has been a discovery for me when I came into this ATD movement that people in poverty hardly know their ancestors. They are cut off generation after generation because society tells them there's nothing to learn from your parents. They were not too good people. And Brzezinski, after 30 years, said maybe the only thing we won is that now a generation knows that their parents were fighters. So many people in poverty have this question of who were our parents, what were their struggle? And the more they know about their history, the more they'll be able to bring their wisdom and their intelligence to the academic community and to the whole human community and to build knowledge. So the connection we've just made between building memory of people in poverty and building knowledge is really, I think, an important insight.
Stacy, there is a question for you, and this is a question. What tips do participants have for unlocking greater creativity, critical thinking among populations that are disempowered and or have received a rote learning education experience that dampens any risk taken to think outside the box based on a bottom-up and asset-based approach?
Well, I think one of the things Donna mentioned is about the role and the power of imagination. If you can imagine something and you believe in it, you can achieve it. One thing I did with this group of boys that I mentioned before with middle school is gave them a blank book, and they had to create a cover that said "My Life" and think about where they wanted their life to be. So to create their autobiography while they were still in middle school. And at first they were like, well, what do you mean? But once they got going, they really embraced that project. Another thing was looking at their cultural heroes, and I said, you cannot use sports figures. So this particular group of boys represented many countries, and many of them, like Bruno just said around memory and history, had no idea who some of the heroes were in their native lands. So pushing them to dig a little deeper and think about that, and then share with everyone, what went on in their own country. So I think that's part of it, is just helping them see beyond what they already know. And also, I've recently gotten involved with something called the question formulation technique. It's kind of an old area of education, but it's having more force now, where the teacher doesn't ask all the questions, the students ask the questions. So giving them something to look at, a political cartoon, for instance, and having them generate a list of questions about what they might have about it, and going from there, and then really narrowing down. So it's about sharing the power, sharing the ownership. We have a saying on the board at the Adult Learning Center that we are the provider of your education, but you are the owner of your education. And from the very beginning, telling them there is no hierarchy here. Just because I'm the teacher, you're an adult, you have stuff to share too. And making that really, really, really clear. And just one point about informed consent, it's a little off topic, but one of the things I learned in grad school was looking at the literacy level of the consent form. That's not enough, or translated into their language. We assume that an 8th grade education is, people have that and they can understand that. That might not be the case. I have students that have a 4th grade education. So really, really making sure you understand the community you're going into.
Thank you, Stacy. So perhaps for closing, there is a question that is about what lessons have you learned about balancing rigorous and systematic research, science, and social action advocacy? And any one of the presenters can address this question.
I'll start. So I think that involving people with direct experience of poverty in poverty research from the get-go is one of the ways to build the foundation for very rigorous research. And I say that because in my experience, the very core involvement of people who have a direct experience with whatever the issue is that is under study know from their own experience what important questions to even be asking. What is the most important research question that actually can lead to useful information for change? And I think Stacy put it really well in her presentation and in her remarks, that let's have this research be useful. And all along the way, if there is clear, accountable, transparency, audit trail, clear thinking about the research design, about how the research question was designed, and all the processes for generating knowledge related to that question, those are the steps for rigorous work, for rigorous research. And keeping in mind that the resources that go into this kind of knowledge generation are precious. So they need to, in fact, lead to some change in circumstances for those most directly affected. To me, that is a kind of mindset. It's also a kind of way of thinking about approaches for carrying out the research. And I think it has implications for partnerships. So in a lot of the Center for Social Policy work, we engaged stakeholders who represented different sectors, the nonprofit sector, the advocacy sector, the policymaking sector, the people with a direct experience of poverty. And actually from that collaboration, we developed consensus on the most important research questions, and then what were gonna be the processes for gathering information, and what was going to be the hope for outcome and how could we together make that happen. To me, that represents a level of rigor that often, I felt quite comfortable with, and it was, collaboration from the start.
Any other of the presenters would like to make some other remarks, comments?
May I? So if I may just add on to what Donna has said, I think this, the balance needs to come out of a real belief that co-creation of knowledge is possible. So I think very shallow research comes out of just kind of desktop or archive, particularly in researching about the realities of people's lives. And so I think it's important not to work with a deficit model of research and just think of people and not focus on what people don't have. So people living in poverty might not have good formal education, or they might not have a degree in something, but what do they have and what do they bring to the table? I think it's the emphasis on that. And also just to, if there are external researchers involved in that research, is also to be very much aware that the researchers are in that space because they also have some things that they don't know. And that's why they're there to gain that knowledge. I think it's really about negotiating the terms for a real, it's not easy, it's difficult, but it's possible to have a kind of a real authentic, deep engagement around the co-creation of knowledge.
There you go. Go for it.
Bruno?
Yes, I want to go back to one point Stacy made in her presentation about low-level bigotry that is low expectation. I think in all the research we did, people experiencing poverty really wanted to get also at the knowledge that academics had. And that confrontation was extremely useful. And I remember, so that's one point I wanted to make. It's not just that people in poverty have knowledge that others don't have. It's both ways. And that academics really share their theories is very important. Not just that they listen and that use the people in poverty as informants. For example, at some point there was a mutual interpretation of stories with a group of researchers and a group of people in poverty. And there was really misunderstanding. And suddenly one of the researchers explained the theory of Maslow, the pyramid of Maslow. And he explained the theory that some needs are more important than others. You know, that first you need to eat, then maybe you need to that, and maybe if you have all this, maybe you need culture. And that theory, once on the table, people in poverty were stunned that that theory was taught in many schools of social work and sociology. And they really rebuilt the theory as a sphere, not as a pyramid. The sphere where all the basic fundamental human rights are equivalent. So what I mean is that we do need fundamental research, because if we jump into advocacy, we tend to think that we know what has to change. We did big work in France in school and with the French schools and had an impact on the reform of school. But unions of teachers said to us, but we know what has to change. We say, wait a minute, maybe you don't. And we forced them to really think together and to realize that the theory around was that people in poverty didn't like school because school was useless for them. That was the theory of many advocates for school. So make school work and people in poverty will be interested. But that was totally wrong. People in poverty, because they analyzed that people in poverty don't come to meetings, don't really react to when they are asked to come to school. And it was interpreted as they are not interested. People say, well, they manage without school, so they are not interested. And that was so wrong and so humiliating to hear that for the people in poverty. It's not that they don't care, it's that they care too much. They are so tense, so anxious. They have such a wounded history with school that when they come, they are too nervous. And so reframing the debate between school don't work, so they are not interested, into they are so wounded by school that it's really a matter of relationship, of mutual fear. So what I'm saying is that advocate work needs to be careful not to jump into research to convince institutions and policymakers. They have to make sure they have the right struggle. And unions in France have more and more be allied with the ATD, understanding that, yeah, struggle for the workers is very important, and struggle for people who are private or who are deprived from work is also very important. So, in other words, that equation, advocacy and policy, is missing a term, which is really the question that people most suffering, people in poverty, have. And that's what and we have to be ambitious that people in poverty have very important questions, and they can get the tools to make those questions become really sources of research. So it's a bit confused what I said, but I wanted to make these different points. And finally, to say really the most important for research is that it's not the researchers who are the only ones who have questions. They do have questions, but people in poverty have questions. And they need to formulate these questions, and these questions are sometimes the most powerful to change policies.
From the participants. And this is the question. Up to what point have you achieved writing research, both with people living in poverty and with academics? I believe that this common writing empowers both people living in poverty and academics.
Yes.
Yes. So my teammates and I have done this a lot. I think I already told you about a book where we were co-authors, basically 8 other persons and myself. And let me tell you a little bit of story about this. The book is Parenting in Public. And what happened is I had a table of contents over supper, 9 of us at 3 points in time over a year's period of time, divvied up the plan for writing, with the idea that at the end of each chapter, there was a reflection by a mother who had lived in a shelter, a staff member and director of family shelters. And we had a way to help each other with the writing by getting together at various points in time over a year. And it was always over food. And there was one person who really didn't like writing. So the approach we used was that she audio taped her thoughts. And then that turned into a transcription, which became her reflection, which was included at the end of all the chapters that she had a role in. The final time that we gathered over dinner, we audio recorded the conversation with the question being, so what? What does all that we've learned, that we've shared together in this focused process of co-writing, so what? What does it all mean? And we audio taped that conversation, which then was transcribed and became a group reflection at the end of the book. And then I wrote a final chapter. This had not been approved ahead of time by the publisher. And so I said to the publisher, this is how I want to do it. And each person needs to get paid in advance. So the publisher, Columbia University Press, forked over $100 for each person to be able to do this. And the book went forward in that way. And that experience and many other experiences have been so satisfying. I think that's some of the finest work that I you know, that and other ones that I feel most proud of. There are always ways to engage people in co-writing.
I think that the following question is related to what Donna is talking about. And a participant's question is, do you all have some thoughts on how that research results can be respectfully promoted in practical, immediate actions? It is unfortunately not always possible to have physical presence with folks in poverty when approaching an issue. But other than clearly stating where the research came from and how it was built, is there another way to make sure their knowledge is accredited and enhanced by the knowledge they have given through you as we practically work on policy, etc.?
I'm not sure if I only heard part of the question, but was the question how to ensure that the knowledge that comes from communities or people living in poverty is properly accredited, and is that correct? And I
That's
suppose
correct.
for me, so one of the ways would be to acknowledge acknowledge that all knowledge doesn't need to live in a book. So while creating the book or the document or the documentary or whatever that is, while that is important and one of the outcomes, maybe it is to have a conversation with the people who've contributed to think, is there a different way? Is there some other way that you would like to use this information that could be useful? Could it be part of, say, a letter to local government or a document that you produce that you want something done? I'm just talking in abstraction at the moment. Is it an issue that maybe you think young people need to know about? So maybe we can create a digital story or something on social media to raise awareness with young people. Is it something that could find its way into the curriculum as a teaching aid or a youth program or some kind of civic action? So those are the different ways that I would imagine, I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, but those are the different platforms in which I think co-created knowledge and knowledge from different sources can find their way into places and platforms that are useful to the community. And of course, being in a museum context, I would think about, is there an exhibition, for example, that you want to create from that or something like that?
Yes, I want to add that we are optimistic in this webinar. We are right to be optimistic. And I like the way Donna proves that it's possible and it has worked. And we have seen also studies on poverty as violence, or we have influenced the goals at the UN, introducing that when the UN wanted to say we're going to raise 50% of people in poverty, this was really terrible. And we did a study with the UN and experts and people in poverty that led to the UN to say, leave no one behind. So it is possible and it works, but it is a hell of a struggle to make sure this knowledge is accredited. And we are really proud that this seminar drew more than 100 people to listen to it, and more will listen. It works, it is pertinent, it is ethically sound, and it's a struggle to continue to demand that this happens. We are establishing in France a partnership with the highest research authority, which is called CNRS, and another authority to make a permanent place to accredit this work. People in poverty have the experience that when they speak, they are not believed. They are not believed. People will believe more academics than people in poverty. That's the way it is, at least that's my country. And so, yes, it's hope, but it's a struggle to make sure this method and the knowledge of people in poverty, their intelligence, is really accredited, as the auditor said. And also, when one of the people in poverty who participated in that group to create that permanent space, she said, we want to change what's written about poverty. we want to change what's written, because what's written remains. And so there's a lot of work ahead of us. That's what I'm saying. A lot of work, but it's a lot of hope also.
This is the end of the webinar, and we want to thank again to Merrimack College and to North Shore Community College for sponsoring us. And we will continue seeing you. Dave is going to give you more information about the following webinars to this one.
Hi, yeah, just another reminder, on April 25th, reframing to expand the realm of possibilities for social change. It's interesting to see a few of those ideas I think came up in our discussion today. You can register now at atdfw.org/reframing. And then on June 4th, about the multidimensional aspects of Poverty Project, which is an international research project going on right now in 6 countries around the world with people in poverty as co-researchers, along with academics and practitioners who work alongside people living in poverty. So if you're interested in learning more about some of the ideas today and how they happen concretely in a massive research project in partnership with Oxford University, that's going to be a really interesting conversation, and we hope you'll come along. Thanks so much. You'll be getting an email follow-up with a recording of this. Feel free to share it around. Take care.